As some of you know, I used to run the Pittsburgh World Affairs Council, and after my tenure in the Air Force, I did that for about a dozen years, and early on in that job, we had a World Affairs Institute, much the same kind of thing as we're going to have next week with our high school or 2 weeks in our high school symposium. We have a very similar program in Pittsburgh called the World Affairs Institute, and we wanted to introduce, this will sound really old to you, we wanted to introduce our audience of 400 high school students to this thing called globalization. It's a new concept. No one really quite knew what it was. I mentioned it to a couple of board members at the time, and they thought I was I was accused of trying to establish world government. I had to explain that that was a little different. But ERIK, who was then the senior vice president at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, came up and did one of the most spectacular presentations. And I only lament that we really don't have the venue here to accommodate PowerPoint and all those wonderful things, because it was a light show extraordinaire. But ERIK doesn't need light shows. He's just a great guy and a great speaker. And I particularly want to highlight for the students here that if you ever think you're supposed to have one career, ERIK is one of these guys who embodies this notion that you move from one thing to another because of your expertise and the experience and the ability to learn new tricks. Since 2010, ERIK has been the A.T. Kearney's, that's a headhunting firm, consulting firm, they do lots of things. And he is director for their Global Business Policy Council, which I think gives him mandate to do almost anything. That's a strategic advisory service designed for the world's top CEOs and business leaders, so I guess I can't apply. And he's been doing that for the last 5 years. He remains a senior advisor at CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He had been there for, actually, you had just taken that job, I think, about the time that you came to Pittsburgh in '98. He was senior vice president and their William A. Schreier Chair in Global Analysis, also director of CSIS's Global Strategy Institute. Before then, he worked for some guy named Kissinger. I remember him as director of research at Kissinger Associates. He served on more advisory boards than I want to name today. He's a fellow of the World Economic Forum. He's a distinguished faculty associate in international business at the Smeal School of Business at Penn State University. He's a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He has spoken extensively throughout the United States and at last count 28 countries. He dodged a bullet. He was supposed to be in Istanbul this weekend, but he got to come home and be with us and mom and sister and so on. He speaks regularly to corporate, professional, academic, and civic audiences. Author of several publications, working on a book, which I'm sure he'll tell us a little bit about, on global strategic trends and their effects on governance. Holds a bachelor's degree from Colby College and a master's from the Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies and an MBA from the Wharton School, some small little business school at the University of Pennsylvania. So you really are in for a treat, and the only way I could try and capture what I know ERIK has to share with us is talk about technological change and global trends, which is about as broad a topic as I could have figured out. And without any further ado, ERIK, the podium is yours.
Sky, thank you very much. How does one follow up on an introduction like that? Sky, Karen, Jim, very, very grateful to have the opportunity to be here. As Sky mentioned, this is home, ladies and gentlemen. And it's doubly and triply meaningful to me because I have my mother and sister in the audience here. And we have a number of very dear, dear family friends with us. So the pressure's on, let me tell you. I would like to begin, if you'll forgive me, with a personal story. A few years back, my wife, who's Chilean, and I took our then very, very small children on what I presume a few of you have done, that long overnight flight from Miami down to Santiago. And we finally got there, and we were waiting through the passport line. And my then son, who was about this high, suddenly reached an amazing discovery. "Mommy and Daddy," he said, "they are not speaking English here." And we smiled and explained to him once again that Chile was a place where people spoke a different language, Spanish. And he thought about that one for a while, and then as we moved forward in the line, he said, "But why don't they speak English? It's so much easier to understand." Now, I'd like to start with this story because I think that the scale and the scope and the speed of the change that is enveloping you and me every single day means that you and I have to develop a new grammar, a new understanding of the changing circumstances around us. And that is no easy task. As Sky mentioned in his way overly gracious introduction, I have the opportunity to work with a number of political and business leaders, and I can tell you that this keeps them awake at night, and it should. Because in the end, we are looking at a remarkable, constantly transitioning environment within which all of us need to be navigating in the future. Now, as Sky mentioned, the subject matter of the comments assigned to me was global trends and technological change. Thanks a lot for that one. It's a massive assignment, but it lets me it lets me take a commanding heights view of some of the sweeping changes that are taking place right now. And if you'll permit me, I'd like to share with you some of the broader conclusions on change before doing a deeper dive on what's happening in technology. So how do we begin to think about this? Well, Sky mentioned that 26 years ago, I was director of research at Kissinger Associates. This is when Scowcroft and Eagleburger went into Bush 41. Jerry Bremer, who would later be of Green Zone fame, came to the firm. And they were, in terms of the geopolitical prism, they were heady days indeed. The ignominious collapse of the Soviet Union made all of us rediscover what the role of the US was in the world, what would follow the Cold War paradigm. It was a creative destruction when it came to international relations theory. And then simultaneous to that, in one key developing country after the next across the world, we saw them shed their skin of the authoritarianism that existed there. One by one, we saw statist economic systems fall and market structures come in their place. Think Brazil, think Argentina, think other countries in the developing world. And then on top of that, from a standpoint of how we begin to discern the severity, the magnitude of change around us, we had a number of conflicting accounts. New World Order was bantied around during this time, the Sky remembers. And my friend Frank Fukuyama came out with an essay and then a book that followed called The End of History. Bottom line here is that liberal capitalism and democracy had prevailed to such an extent that there was no other alternative. Well, we sat around in 1989 and we wondered whether over the course of our lifetimes we would ever relive such an historically significant moment of this kind of sweeping fundamental change that was affecting all our lives in one way or another. And I would like to begin here as a point of departure this afternoon by saying that now, for very different reasons and for very different circumstances, sure enough, we may have yet achieved another similar transformational moment. I believe that we need to look, or we can begin to bucket the big change that we see across the planet in 5 key categories. We need to be thinking anew about the composition of the human family, the core demographic trends that are changing our lives. Then add to that the notion that at least what we thought was a robust understanding of resource management and stewardship has now been transformed, in some cases, even turned on its head. Add to that what I think we all can stipulate here is a turbulent and uncertain global economic outlook. And then more generally, when we think about where things are with respect to the capacity of leaders and their institutions and their processes to navigate, we need to be asking about a broader challenge of governance. So each of these four categories, demographics, resources, economics, and politics, and governance, all have monumental connections that we need to track to this overarching phenomenon of technological change, scientific discovery, technological innovation, and then technological diffusion of technologies across the world. So if you'll allow me, let me begin by just saying a few words about each of these first four core global drivers that I think we all need to be watching, beginning with the nature of the human family. Now, in 1989, if you would ask anybody about the global population, we would have said, yeah, sure, we're talking about an exponential growth, fed by the Green Revolution. If we look at the global numbers, they were pretty clear. In 1950, the world population stood at about 2.5 billion people. It had risen to over 6 billion by the turn of the century. And that was emblematic of this kind of vertical growth through which you and I were living. Where do things now stand? Well, according to the UN data, refreshed only about 2 weeks ago from the UN Population Bureau, we believe that we now stand in this world right now at about 7.35 billion people. We're adding roughly about 2.5 people to the planet every single second. Now, where are things going from here? The evidence suggests that, at least as we think about things, this continued population growth will define the international environment, at least insofar as demography is concerned. We're looking at a world somewhere in the range of 9.7 billion by the middle of the century, by the year 2050, and 11.2 billion projected median variant by the United Nations now, way out to the end of the century, to the year 2100. 11.2 billion people. Now that's consistent, more or less, that kind of growth, to the kind of growth that you and I have witnessed in earlier phases of our lives. But the headline here is very different. The headline here is that we have reached the end of demographic growth, or we are reaching it, more precisely. It's the end of history when it comes to population. Why is that? Because way back when, in 1965, 1970, if you're looking at rate of growth, global growth, you see what was a significant apogee. And then after that period, 1965 to 1970, it has been a down, down, down proposition, projected out by the United Nations now to the end of the century, practically to zero. Now, what does that mean? It means that our exponential world, exponential growth in population is no more, that we can expect to see a plateauing of global population growth sometime after the turn of the century. Now, the big play for you and me between now and then, and I think we can all reconvene here and compare notes at that time, we need to be thinking about how the additional populations occur, what impact they have, and how they affect our social patterns. And I'll begin by saying that between now and then, we're going to be seeing profound asymmetries in the rate of growth between areas of the world, I think in particular about Africa and Asia, and other areas that we're likely to see low or even negative growth in Europe and in some other areas of the world, including countries like Japan. What we can do now on the basis of the projections going forward is to define what I call waves of depopulation. Germany started in 2005 its population peaked at about 82 million, projected to decline to about 63 million by the end of the century. Japan, in 2010, 126 million was its peak, going down to 83. Even China, in the year 2030, can expect to see a peak, in no small part because of its one-child policy. It now stands, we were talking about this, Jim, last night, about 1.4 billion, probably going down to 1 billion projected by the end of the century. In 2040, Brazil, well, reached its peak of 238 million, going down to 200. Mexico, 164 to 148 in 2050. Even India, believe it or not, will be peaking in terms of population now, based on current projections, at 1.7 billion in the year 2060. The point here is, in each of these countries, in both advanced economies and in developing economies, we'll see these age waves occur, and they have huge implications for the economies, the social integrity, the political systems, and a range of other factors in each of these countries that we can explore, if you'd like, in our question and answer period. Now, in the meantime, there are a number of countries that we think may have a demographic advantage. For example, France will see a steady increase of population to about 76 million or so by the year 2100. Likewise, the United Kingdom, 82 million by the same period. US will probably go up to about 450 million by current UN projections. So what this means is that we're going to see a very, very significant rush with respect to age structures, economic markets that develop, how changing consumer tastes are satisfied, and in the end, how much social and political integrity we see across these systems. Now, age waves are a big indicator of what is to come. Add to that the broader structure of population, and here the whole story is in global aging. The 65 and above crowd now stands, expressed globally, at about 12.3%. If we look out to the end of the century, that 12.3% increases to 28.1%. The octogenarian crowd, those of us who are over 80, increases from 1.7% to 7.6%. Think about this country. We're adding 10,000 boomers to the retirement community estimated every day. Talking about, depending who you consult with, between 40 and 80 million over the next 2 decades. So if we think about this aging overhang superimposed on depopulating populations, very significant asymmetries with respect to high growth in areas like Africa and negative growth in areas like continental Europe. In the end, you have a very, very complex demographic structure that you could not have predicted in 1989. And then on top of that, there are likely to be significant changes in population patterns. So we see it here with boomers and Xers and millennials. We certainly see it in Europe and elsewhere. For example, I was in Europe recently, very surprised to understand from the Commission there that currently, that is this year, 2015, 40% of children in Europe are born outside of marriage. Did you know that? I had no idea. And in some countries, France, Slovenia, a couple others, the number is 60%. Isn't that remarkable? We know that marriage has been declining in this country, and we also know that women who do marry are waiting later in their lives to marry, a significant pattern. In China, because of the one-child policy, we see wholesale reorganization of social fabric. What happened to the aunts and uncles? Well, they don't exist in the framework of a one-child society. And what you do have are little emperors and empresses, and a range of problems that come out of that. Imagine now, this I find quite extraordinary. Young women now in Germany of childbearing age are likely to have, over the course of their lifetimes, more husbands than they have children. more husbands than they have children. I told this to my wife at the dinner table a couple weeks ago, and she had this faraway look. You see, we have 2 children. And I did not take that to be a very positive reaction. So if we look at these really are tectonic shifts in the demographic sphere, and I think that they really are an important staging point as we think about how these global trends are beginning to affect us. Now, if that's how our human family is changing, then what about how we cope with the resources that keep us going? And I'd like to begin with the notion here that global demand for food and for water and for energy are all increasing at a pace much faster than the rate of population. So you could say, well, look, if we've got a plateauing population in the years ahead, let's not worry about it. But in the end, increasing per capita consumption in all 3 areas means what I think will be significant supply-demand pressures and significant scarcity and volatility issues in the years ahead. All you have to do is to look at what's happening in the area of food. The OECD and the Food and Agricultural Organization are both projecting that we probably need something on the order of 70% more food by the middle of the century. And they both note in their joint report that they issue each year that supply has declined from 2.6% over the last decade to current level of 1.7%. What does that mean? We are writing food checks that we simply can't cash. And unless and until we can change policies, look into other technological approaches or a range of other factors, we can expect this kind of volatility in a core market to increase in the future. Now, I'm just back also from California, and I can tell you that the water situation there is as acute as the news reports suggest. The OECD is suggesting that 3.5 billion people in countries across the planet could live in water stress by the year 2030. Done a lot of work in this area, and we see declining aquifers, groundwater access, greater competition for resources, a range of other factors, all of which indicate that water, sure enough, is the next blue gold. We've done work at Kearney looking at what water scarcity might mean for economic activity. And our projections out to the year 2020 suggest that we could see foregone economic output on the order of $2.2 trillion, with, by the way, China absorbing a big chunk of that $900 billion out to the year 2020. Though I'm sure there are folks here who have looked into water use in China. There are a number of compelling articles and books, one of which is entitled The River Runs Black, in terms of the problems that Beijing is facing with water use. Now, energy is clearly the resource where the world has turned upside down. Same planet, different world. If I'd walked into Kissinger in '89 and said, you know, Henry, I think we've got self-sufficiency on the horizon here before too very long, I would have been looking for another job. But really, we face that prospect right now. The shale revolution has created realities that were virtually unpredictable way back when. I was just yesterday doing an interview with U.S. News and World Report on the Arctic. And in the end, we're seeing the confluence of environmental degradation, climate change, and we're seeing the possibility now of new sea lines of communication, new passages for trade. So we have the confluence there of geopolitics, resource exploitation. There are a number of very significant military issues now at work, all kind of blended together in the context of the Arctic Council, of which the U.S. has assumed chairmanship, or will soon assume chairmanship over the coming year. You and I now are witnessing a titanic battle, shale versus fossil, and we're going to see continued big movements over the next few years. The world, as you're all acutely aware, is awash in oil. Saudi Arabia is producing at record levels. We now see a number of core wild cards that could bring the price of oil down even further than also the levels that we thought would be unimaginable way back when. It begs the question of how, in this country, we can begin to engineer a transition from fossils to alternatives that's more significant in the end. Clearly, we need to be focused on that on all sides of the political aisle. But at the global level, for the time being, the question is, who's the next big shale producer? And I believe that probably we're going to see India and especially China, which sits on massive shale resources, to begin to exploit things, horizontal drilling and some of the other technologies now well known here in the next couple of years. The UK, Poland, Argentina are all on the list after that. I would say 2018 to 2020, Argentina sits on very significant resources. And then after that, I would point to Brazil, maybe Saudi Arabia, maybe Romania. Now, in the meantime, as we're thinking about this confluence of global drivers, we need to acknowledge that whether we like it or not now, we've entered a period of resource geopolitics. We are now seeing acute global competition for both direct and indirect control of our resources. We see it in the Beijing-Moscow natural gas deal that was done against sanctions not long ago. We see it day by day in the creation by China of islands in the South China Sea. We see this in Latin America and Africa with a movement for equity control by China and other countries as we think about this world of resources to come. Now, resources clearly fuel the global economy, and here I think we can begin by acknowledging that no one is ready to bet the barn on what's going to happen on the global economy in the light of the incredible volatility that we see in front of us. But there are a few core things that we can think about. The first is that after the savage Great Recession that was visited on us, we've now moved into a period where the jury is out of significant monetary and economic cross-currents that create a very difficult environment to predict. The IMF is projecting global growth at about 3.5% this year. That's moderate, but it would be the first to suggest that probably we could see significant volatility and downside risk on that projection. The good news from our standpoint is that the period we're in now is somewhat analogous to what we saw in the mid-1990s, when a resurgent U.S. growth made our country the most effective economic piston in the global economic motor. We do a thing at A.T. Kearney called the Foreign Direct Investment Confidence Index. And this asks leaders across the world where they want to put their money over the next 3 years. And this year, it was a flight to safety proposition. Of the top 25 markets, 15 of them were in Europe. Who was on the top of the list? I'm proud to say that it was the U.S. I would be even prouder to say that it would be the U.S. in a more robust, competitive global economic environment, but we'll take what we can get. This is the third year the U.S. has been at the top of the list, and the first year, we were delighted with the news, obviously. And we didn't know, but President Obama decided to make reference to our report in his State of the Union speech. You can imagine that the telephones lit up after that one, and we got a couple free meetings at the White House after that. So in the end, well, we see a very strong U.S. as a global economic piston for continued growth. In Europe, the uncertainties continue to be significant, but I would argue that there is the potential for more resilience in Europe than may be indicated in the popular media, at least. Germany continues to chug along, and their capacity to get through these cascading crises in Greece, and then we'll have the Brexit debate coming in the future, suggests to me that there might be some more significant potential for a reignition of growth in Europe. Japan continues to be a question mark. Now, the second core message on the global economy is that we have a return of history this time around. What do I mean by that? Well, in the old days, it was the advanced economies that were generating the lion's share of global economic growth, and then ultimately they surrendered that position to the developing economies. Well, now we see that the advanced economies are in the driver's seat once again. Emerging markets as a percentage share of global economy have declined from 56.8 to 53.3, and the World Bank is projecting what it calls, uncharacteristically I should add, a broad-based slowdown in emerging markets in the years ahead. Still, longer range, we need to be thinking about the shift to emerging markets. It's inevitable, especially with the population dynamics that I talked about earlier. But nevertheless, we need to be thinking about how we begin to coordinate our significant macroeconomic and monetary responses in the face of the kind of volatility that we're going to be seeing. In the meantime, we're in for a big global shakeout, especially when Janet Yellen decides to pull the trigger with respect to interest rates. Imagine now we have Draghi with the ECB, Mario Draghi with the ECB in Europe, trying to sequence his quantitative easing at a time when the United States is increasing interest rates. The exchange rate and the broader interest rate dynamics are going to be tremendously complex for these central banks to handle. Final area before finally turning to technology, and I promise you I'll get there, is in this issue of governance. Three quick messages here. The first is that power ain't what it used to be. Power ain't what it used to be, even in 1989. My dear friend Moises Naim of Carnegie Endowment of International Peace has just done a book called The End of Power. It's a great read. And the bottom line here is that power is easier to lose, certainly harder to exercise. And he talks about the pressures of the Lilliputians, the micro-networks that constrain progressively the capacity of leaders, no matter where they are, to carry out their mandate. Second point is that we're seeing more and more polarization of decision-making all over the world. Now, no doubt that doesn't apply to the Colorado Springs City Council. But I'm here to tell you that in Washington, D.C., the former chairman of CSIS, Sam Nunn, once told me, well, you know, ERIK, in Washington, you can't take friendship personally. And what we're seeing here is where there used to be a healthy, normal distribution curve of consensus, a civility in the way that people made decisions together. Now we have politics by ever wider standard deviation. Pew Research Center has done some remarkable quantification of this. It's quite remarkable. But it's not only the US. Look at France now, the Front National and Marine Le Pen. If you look in Spain and Podemos movement, broader European Parliament results, we see it in one core area after the next. And then we see broader pressures on the whole notion of democracy, not only in established areas, but in aspiring democracies. Think about the Arab Spring movement and the consequences with which we're still dealing. From my standpoint, it means that institutions, especially those that fail to anticipate and adapt to the big, longer-range trends like these, in effect, will continue to fall behind. So now, ladies and gentlemen, I finally arrived at the role of technology. And I'd like to begin with this. I picked this up at King Soopers yesterday. It is a Halloween card, and it reads on the front, "Come to the dark side." Let me open this up. This is Darth Vader and the Star Wars anthem. Now, I share this with you, and I hope somebody will take this away because my mother will throw it away as soon as we get home. I brought this card here because, at least according to my friends at Singularity University, this card has the same computational power, maybe even a little more, than the Apollo 11 mission to the moon. Now, the Apollo guidance computer that guided that mission, which we believe is approximately 664 kilobytes of memory, is probably more basic than most of the toasters that you all used this morning to generate toast, to warm your toast. This is emblematic of how far we've come on this. Now, many in this audience have an iPhone 6 smartphone. At least, I guess it's next week that the 6S's and are going to be introduced. And each one of those phones now in our pocket has a faster processor and more memory storage than the Curiosity rover that's now on the surface of the planet Mars. Quite remarkable. Now, the global race for computational, especially supercomputation, is nothing short of astonishing. Now, where is the fastest supercomputer in the world right now? China. It's China's National University of Defense Technology, Tianye 2, roughly translated Milky Way 2, with 3.12 million computing cores, a processing speed of nearly 34 petaflops. That is 33,860 trillion calculations per second. Now, years ago, I had the opportunity to work with Sandia National Laboratories on some modeling, and we used the Red Storm computer. There are a trillion calculations a second, teraflop computer. We thought that was the biggest deal. And I asked a friend at Sandia about Red Storm, and he said, oh, we scrapped that thing a long time ago. I mean, there are like an order of magnitude of 1 million ahead of that now. And I'm pleased to announce, without trying to sound nationalistic, that the US has announced the construction of 2 supercomputers out to the year 2023 that we think are going to exceed the Chinese supercomputer by about 6 to 7, 8 times. Now, where does this take us? Massive modeling, computational capabilities, financial markets, weather, in the case of the national labs, a whole range of defense issues that are critical. Now, in parallel, we have artificial intelligence now that we've all seen has made significant strides. Now, many of us have been watching AI for many years. But we now know that computers have brought the world's finest chess player, for example, to his knees. Even, and this is sacrosanct, that the computer Watson on Jeopardy, those of you who are Jeopardy fans, reduced the very best Jeopardy players to rubble. And most analysts now concede that these specialized computer uses, what we can call ANI, or artificial narrow intelligence, are just symptomatic of how computers have surpassed humans in a number of ways. So all of these examples are emblematic of where things are going, and to be sure, it goes well beyond information technology. Connectivity across technologies has been a key feature in the revolution at work around us. The explosion of social media is driving wholesale new patterns of interaction. Third biggest population in the world, Facebook. In the end, that's where we are. 1 billion users from communications capabilities, Twitter, Snapchat, WhatsApp, from dating sites like Match.com. And is there anyone here who's been using Ashley Madison? I was wondering if anyone would like to come clean before that's the adultery site that is encountering some big-time problems these days. So what are the symptoms of the current state of technology? Very briefly, erosion of power, Moses Naim, the Lilliputian effects become all the more significant. We have reached a point at which you choose your truth. No matter what you believe, no matter how far off it may happen to be, you can find compatriots on the web who believe the same thing. There are shifts in economic activity. This thing that we called globalization way back when has certainly been accelerated by the whole thing. National competition policies are predicated on the capacity to move in terms of technology now. We are seeing an accelerated shift in broader macroeconomic terms between manufacturing on the one hand and service side on the other. Rapid diversion of labor to autonomous or truly autonomous devices, robots in air, land, and sea. And then we have a big and important debate in front of us on declining productivity in the face of many of these technological issues. From my world, the private sector mostly these days, it means the sudden and disruptive change to the commercial environment. Think about the leaders of Kodak Company, that's the classic. You talk about changing lanes or incapacity to do that. And I think that every business leader now is looking over his or her shoulder, terrified that something is going to happen, some new platform technology or something else that might really change where they're going. And then there's the fundamental shift in terms of broader economic paradigm. Sharing economy, Uber, Airbnb. Suddenly these platform networks are beginning to replace the very companies that carry out whatever is done. So where are things going from here? And then I'll tie up, Scott. Well, as fascinating as these current circumstances are, I believe that what we have in front of us is all the more significant. The rate of change. I believe that there's probably something to be said about the theory of Ray Kurzweil, who's written a number of important books on technology, including The Singularity is Near, where we may have exponential change as a result of this constellation of interrelated areas of technological development. Kurzweil believes that progress in the entire 20th century, which is looked through the lens of the state of technology the way it existed in 1989, means that the entire century could be accomplished now in a mere 20 years. And he believes that as we look at the 21st century, we could see this exponential growth in technologies and their effects as many as 1,000 times as great as the past 100 years. Well, let's be a little more specific than that. In computational power, I think it's pretty clear that if your iPhone in your pocket now is now more significant than the Mars lander, in 8 or 10 years, probably it will be more significant than you your cell phone. In the end, it's very possible that we'll see smartphones with more capacity than computational capacity as human beings. Cybersecurity is a big issue. Edward Snowden reminded us all of that. The whole notion of vulnerabilities, the double edge of technology, will be a big deal in the future. The OPM hack and the 21 million plus victims that were a part of that are here to tell you all about that. In artificial intelligence, HAL is going to be a pleasant memory. We'll move from ANI, that is artificial narrow intelligence, to artificial general intelligence. It will make all kinds of new possibilities a reality. In biotechnology, many of you take The Economist, I'm sure. And a recent issue highlighted editing humanity, the prospects for genetic enhancement. And no doubt there are folks here from the medical community. CRISPR, the gene editor capability now, is creating massive opportunities on the one hand and serious ethical and moral dilemmas on the other about germline editing, designer babies, although I'm sure my mother would like to revise my own trajectory, impact on generations, personalized, customized medicine, and then all of us, I think, are going more and more to be dealing with wearables. That is, we ourselves as patients are going to become the data. Even Ralph Lauren has surrendered to this trend. They've just put out a shirt with all kinds of sensors, so you can tell your pulse and everything else as you think about how you navigate your day. In robotics, more on that. The Australians mentioned today that they have put an autonomous starfish eater in the water to save their reefs. There are a number of very significant robotic examples, including that remarkable rover on the planet Mars. In medicine, the Da Vinci robot is doing heart surgery now, many other key examples. Bioprinting is another area where we're going to be seeing very significant progress in the immediate years. Just out in California, as mentioned, and there was a company down the road called Organovo. Have any of you heard of this? Organovo, new organs. And they're bioprinting kidneys and livers now in 3D printers. Really quite remarkable. Internet of Things is at the center of our world. We're talking about the prospect by year 2020 of some 50 billion devices that are going to be connecting with one another. This is quite remarkable, much more than your refrigerator monitoring that you need new orange juice. These self-monitoring machines will have huge, broader macroeconomic implications. So what is the net here? I think that, generally speaking, these technological advances, double-edged as they are, represent a tremendous opportunity. But there are a number of questions that we need to be asking. Who gets the technology? How is it made available? Will it create even more by way of polarization and stratifications in our society? What will be the impact on established institutions? How will it be factored into our day-to-day living? In terms of democratization and the pressures that I mentioned earlier, there are a range of new social pressures that come with these technologies. We have reliable information to suggest that ISIS, for example, is making extensive use of social media for propaganda, recruitment, messaging, even using walkie-talkie apps for their communication. This will mean a redefinition of defense and security for our students from the academy in the back. The NIC, the National Intelligence Council 2030, has argued that a wider spectrum of instruments of war, precision strike capabilities, cyber instruments, bioterror, will become accessible. It's what years ago I called democratization of superviolence. Now, we've been lucky in the meantime. We've only had retail violence of late, at least post 9/11, but we simply cannot only plan for that. There are fundamental questions about the capacity of government, as well as other institutions, private sector, NGOs, even academia, to keep up with these technological innovations. It's a lot more than EPA dealing with rivers in Colorado and elsewhere. They really have to be dealing with a range of technologies that will be difficult to regulate because they're coming so fast, so furious. And all of us need to be thinking in terms of new paradigms. I loved for many years to talk about technology as the Uber driver on all these broader trends that I've described. When you say that to the young people now, they say, oh yeah, the Uber driver, he's waiting outside. Who called him, you know? We now need to be thinking about these interactions between these core areas going forward. So to summarize, sweeping change, growing challenges to leaders wherever they are, and I think for those who have the capacity to anticipate and plan for these complex futures, a remarkable positive potential effect. Let me end here before taking questions. My son has grown a whole lot, and we were just back in Chile a couple weeks ago. I'm delighted to report to you, ladies and gentlemen, he's now fluent in Spanish and very embarrassed every time his father tries to speak. So thank you very much for hearing me out. Look forward to taking your questions.
How do you do, Mom? All right, questions? Yes, sir. I'm going to repeat them for the Pikes Peak Library District cameras. Where does solar energy fit into all of this?
Solar is absolutely critical on that path, that bridge from fossil to alternatives that we've seen before. And in the end, it is one of several key alternative energy technologies that are contingent in terms of efficiencies of translation of core energy into electricity or whatever use we have. And we are very, very bullish on solar going forward. We think it will be an important and significant pathway in terms of this bridge.
Stephen. I'll summarize the question for Pike's Peak, but and I should tell you that Stephen is an Africanist, so that's why I've been to Africa many times. How do you talked about technology diffusion? These massive, impressive trends in technology are taking place in the West. You know, horizontal companies, networks, and so on. To what extent does this get diffused? How does this get diffused to those parts of the world where, and I'll interject this, where the demographics are different, the economies are different, and the technology isn't there? So how do we do this?
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Stephen. Three brief points. The first is that in a number of countries, they are now looking for customization of existing technologies. And in fact, there is a huge amount of innovation going on, whether it's translating solar into capabilities in terms of developing countries, dealing with water issues, as you know from your time in Africa. That's a huge issue, an estimated 80 billion foregone hours of work by women carrying water from source to village. All of these areas seem to suggest even computation and cheap computers. There's a significant opportunity for innovation to bring the upside effect of many of these technologies to the developing world. Many of these technologies cross boundaries more nearly instantly. And what we're seeing now is that the technology challenge with respect to innovation oftentimes is not between countries, but rather within them. And that's likely to occur in a big way, I think, in many developing countries, including in Africa. Third point is that if we look at the source of technological development and diffusion, it has been in the West in the past. But now we're seeing a shift with respect to a number of origins of new technologies, oftentimes south and east, and oftentimes toward China. Thank you.
Interesting question. I mean, we haven't really talked about education, and the challenge to the United States is, well, we seem to be falling behind in math and science and all these other categories. How does that play into all of that? Is that a greater concern for the U.S., or is this going to level that field somehow?
It's a tremendous source of concern. But we have an interesting dichotomy here, because on the one hand, we have a higher education set of institutions that are the envy of the rest of the world. But on the other hand, if you look at, as Sky has mentioned, if you look at the K through 12 data, we oftentimes score 25, 26, 27th in the world, not only behind other industrialized countries, but often behind developing countries. And I think that a number of people, both in the public and certainly in the private sector, realize that this is a huge challenge to the future competitiveness of the country, especially as you think about how we're ramping up our economy with the sophistication of the kinds of economic and technological drivers that I've tried to describe here. Unless and until we're capable of moving them forward, we are very vulnerable. And then there's the whole notion of labor substitution by robots and autonomous areas. In effect, the race against the machines, as two MIT economists have called it in a very useful book. And I think here that level of displacement, of substitution, is rising. It's no longer merely blue collar, it's moving very rapidly to white collar. And we all need to be thinking long and hard about how we deal with this. And time again, education comes to the center of the debate.
The questions about cyberspace, cyber warfare, and so particularly in a security context, where do we stand? Are we way behind? How does this relationship beginning to set itself up?
The short answer to that, at least at an M-to-M, a military-to-military level, is I don't know. And I'm not sure if anyone does. The last I looked, there were 26 other countries that had mounted with some level of commitment an information warfare capability. But it remains to be seen how far those efforts have developed and what effect they might have. I'm reading a book right now called Ghosts Fleet. Do you know this book? It's a popular book these days. And in effect, it looks at a cyber war. Cyber Pearl Harbor is the point of departure of the book. And I know that there are a lot of people in my neck of the woods in Washington who are extremely worried about this. Now, on the private sector side, I can tell you that many big corporations have not set up sufficient defenses and have not paid the kind of attention that they need to be paying, and the consequences are becoming all the more obvious. And there's a lot of fourth quarter Hail Mary action going on now with respect to trying to set up appropriate defenses and procedures. But that's tremendously difficult to reverse engineer, especially if you've got a very diverse and fast-moving operation. So if we look at a range of public-private sector infrastructure, if we look at the whole notion of espionage, which you didn't mention, but it's obviously really important. In the end, we need to be doing much, much more on both sides of the .gov and .com worlds to address this big issue.
Yes, you mentioned a question I think occurred to me as well. These population trends, to what extent does that involve not only refugees but also just immigration in general?
Right. Thank you. Yes. So the whole notion of depopulation, the points that I raised with respect to depopulation, aging, and aggregate levels of population, all account, at least as far as the latest UN modeling is concerned, for some movement of refugees. But there is likely to be a significant shift down the road owing to different circumstances. I mean, we're all watching the plight of the refugees now in Hungary, for example, and the core policy challenges that the European countries are now facing. And in the end, it's very hard to account for those kind of large-scale flows in these models. When I talked about the 4 countries, that is France, UK, Canada, and the US in terms of a continued upward population trajectory, that was based on assumptions with respect to migrant inflows that might be interrupted for whatever reason, political, social, or whatever. So we need to be mindful that that is a key potential wild card as we look at these projections.
And I think the trains are running through the English Channel now, and they're running out of Kaleti station in Budapest as well. So I think, I can't remember, I was trying to remember, when you came to Pittsburgh, and I think it was 1998, I'm not sure that in Pittsburgh we had discovered the coveted globe. So it may be that you don't have one of these. And for those of you who are new, this is the coveted globe. It is not to be thrown at anybody, but it does fit nicely into a suitcase. Eric, thanks so much for being here with us.
Sky, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Really, really wonderful. Thanks to my family and our dear friends. And Sky, from King Supers, I'd like to
I think I know some people who are going to get this.